I'm Stephanie Borak, Director of Donor Relations at the Coastal Land Trust, and we're glad that you could be here today. There will be a couple links in the chat in just 1 second, if they're not there already, for you to check out. And we will keep everyone on mute during the talk, but we're going to actually manage Q&A a little tiny bit different today. Tim said he's cool. If you have a question in the middle and you want to jump in and ask it, please feel free to do that. Just unmute and ask a question. We'll be a little bit less formal with our Q&A today, and maybe go ask questions as we go along, or type it into the chat, and we'll answer it as those come in. And at the end, if you still have questions, we certainly can keep chatting at the end and do Q&A then. That's no problem. So our speaker today is Tim Tabak. He is a natural resource manager and forestry consultant. Tim earned his forestry degree from NC State and has been a forester his whole career. Here at the Coastal Land Trust, we call Tim our forester, although he's not just ours, because Tim advises us on land acquisition, timber valuation, land management planning, and all kinds of things that we need to know before we go into conservation on a certain piece of property. So Tim, we're so glad to have you as a member of our team, and we're glad to have you with us today. So take it away.
Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction. I've enjoyed working with the Land Trust. It's a neat opportunity for me. Really, in the presentation, I want to talk a little.
Hey, Tim, I totally just made a mistake and I hit a button that muted you. I apologize. So I've never done that before. So you unmute you.
Okay, are we back?
Yes, I'm not going to touch any more buttons. I'm sorry.
We're good. Hey, we got to have a little bit of challenge with Zoom. We have to shake things up a little bit and make it a little more fun, right? But yes, I've really enjoyed working with the North Carolina Coastal Land Trust for many years. And in the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the history of forestry and some of the things that we do with the land trust from a conservation standpoint differently than what corporate forestry may do, and make some comparisons and show some pictures about things that we have done, and then move on to some wildlife opportunities in the end of the presentation. So the first picture is of the original forestry school, one of the first, I guess it is actually the first, or was the first in the country, up at Biltmore. Carl Schenck started the first of science-based forestry, and the date, as far as the presentation, is pretty important because this is in 1898, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of forestry in Eastern North Carolina because it was so dominated by Roper Lumber Company in its early existence. And this building is actually at the cradle of forestry now. It's not in the original location, and folks do use four-wheelers and feed a little more than horseback in the old days. So the next picture is Holly Ridge to New Bern with Roper Lumber Company's holdings in Eastern North Carolina. They had holdings roughly from Holly Ridge all the way to Norfolk, Virginia, millions of acres, 12, 14 sawmills, and were the dominant corporate forestry entity of that time. So the next picture is one of my favorites because I think this is a 1906 picture of some of the Roper Lumber Company's holdings. And I think that in the old days, it was kind of difficult to see the forest for the trees because they were just so big. There's little folks out there that I guess are my size scattered around in the woods if you look close. The first one being Loblolly, the second one Longleaf, and the third Atlantic white cedar. I think the key thing to keep in mind here is these trees are probably hundreds of years old. And so as we try to improve or restore or conserve some of the climax forests that are available to the land trust today, it's not necessarily an easy process because we can't make trees this size very quickly. So as we move on through the history, back during the start of using ships, and one thing that Eastern North Carolina was great for was the longleaf pine. So the naval stores, trees were boxed, the sap was contained, was put into pits, tar kilns, what we call them. I guess the name of the Tar Heel State did come from that. The challenge was many of the trees at this time, because forestry and sawmills haven't evolved, actually when the trees stopped producing the pitch, they basically were left and fell down on the ground and were not sawed. And then in time, the crowd would move to the next number of acres and go from there. So it was actually pretty devastating at the time to lose many acres before a forestry company such as Roper got involved in Eastern North Carolina. So the next picture is relative to logging. The first one on the left, I think, is real important, not only because we're using oxen, horses, and interestingly, the fellows are there in coat and tie and overcoats working in the woods, which is hard for me to imagine. That maybe that was to keep the mosquitoes away in the summer. I don't know. Maybe that would work better than the bug repellent we have to use today. But importantly, in the fore edge of the picture, we see the big logs. In the back, we already see small timber. And so that's a successional forest that's been regenerating. One would assume it's 20 plus years old. So they had some of the same challenges. It wasn't sustainable in a management standpoint like forestry may be today. And what really promoted harvesting, the left-hand picture, that's basically steam generated sawmill. Mills became a lot more productive, and because of that, many more acres were harvested. So this is just lumber production. This is actually a picture of the mill in New Bern. We still weren't to the point where we had vehicles. We did have trains that were able to move lumber and logs, but many were floated. So we're still not in a situation that we are today where there's opportunity other than cutting big logs. As we move into the future of where we are today, we have the opportunity to manage succession a little different because we can cut smaller vegetation. And Roper learned quickly that the opportunity for timberland was not only in growing trees. At the time they found that growing agriculture crop actually was a greater return on their investment. So this is some pictures of cotton plants that were, I think the picture talks about 6 feet tall and 2.5 or 3.5 bales per acre. Well, that's significant. When we think today, we're not much better than that with a whole lot better technology. So the growth rates were there. They were there for timber too. But as all cases, ground does get depleted over time, and we need to do the right thing to try to make things grow properly. And this is a picture of me standing next to a remnant yellow poplar tree that survived up in the mountains or the coastal plain. It's a coastal plain tree that doesn't exist as greatly, we'll say, in Eastern North Carolina. Joyce Kilmer Forest up in the mountains is a place where a person could see a number of yellow poplar in a remnant big forest where a person could probably reach their arms out and touch 2 of these at the same time. This one actually survived because it's on a property corner on relatively steep ground, and it never was cut. We have a few of those trees left. Now, this happens to be a bald cypress tree that's in a vernal pond on the Bern tract, which is a North Carolina coastal land tract parcel. One thing interesting here is this picture. The vernal pond is dry. Some don't dry out as quickly. This was actually dry, I guess, in March of this year, but this tree rivals the size of the yellow poplar that I was standing next to and the trees that were shown earlier on the ownership of Roper Lumber Company. So now I want to move into a little bit about conservation forestry. We all foresters, whether it's corporate or otherwise, manage vegetational succession. The big difference is corporate timberland manages for return on investment. Conservation forestry restores and preserves habitats. So with conservation forestry, we tend to like longleaf pine. It's a late succession species. It may live 250 to 450 years. Conversely, the early succession loblolly pine is more managed for economic return because it grows faster. 100 to 300 year lifetime span. Economic maturity is in 27 to 45 year. However, this causes us, when I say us, North Carolina Coastal Land Trust, and trying to manage a challenge, because the loblolly pine grows so much more quickly than longleaf that we need to figure out ways to establish longleaf and establish it in a way that's sustainable to where we can attempt to grow a climax forest. So we spend our money wisely. So the next picture talks a little bit about climax forest. Island Creek is a land trust parcel. It's here close to New Bern. It's a climax hardwood forest, or it's getting to be. Those trees are not that big, but barring any natural disaster, they'll continue to grow and get large. You know, on the right, we have Springer's Point, which is a climax coastal forest, where we have more oak species that make up that type of forest. There's actually some black walnut on Island Creek. And in the middle picture, we have Gales Creek, which is a coastal forest. It is not far from the Atlantic Ocean. However, that's longleaf. It is a climax species. It is long, but it's not as large as the trees below. And I put a picture, or the same picture that I showed earlier, of the box trees. And I thought that was unique because I can somewhat envision that the longleaf above it will get that big one day, but it won't happen quickly, 100 years from now. So the two pictures on the side are important if they're legible. From an upland forest, we start out with grass, we move to some hardwood underbrush and a little bit of loblolly pine. We mix into almost predominant loblolly pine, and then we might get to loblolly with the hardwoods taking over because the loblollies have started to die. Then 100 years down the road, we're in a mature hardwood forest. On the other side of the coin, in an area like Springer's Point, we might start off as just sand dune. And with the change of tidal flow or waves, we end up pushing sand up. It changes again to a grass to start with, a shrub zone, and eventually we end up with a maritime forest. Now, one unfortunate challenge that we have today is we have a new climax forest in some areas of eastern North Carolina, which is a ghost forest, which has been caused by saltwater intrusion. However that occurs, whether it might be because of rising sea level, or in some cases, you know, when I say we, humans, decided to ditch lands in eastern North Carolina for mosquito control and or to take runoff from inland to the coast. And now saltwater intrusion, because sea level has started to rise, becomes easier to come into the coastal area. So this is creating a saltwater marsh out of an area that was dominated by loblolly pine. So things do change, whether it's as a result of our behavior or otherwise. And I wanted to use the next picture. This is a big representative challenge with the succession of loblolly. This is an old field on the left, taken Google Earth 2005. Within 2 years, we have loblolly pine seedlings that have actually grown at this point probably to 6 to 8 inches tall that now are scattered across the whole field. So if this is actually a stand that was changed into longleaf pine, however, we had to control the loblolly before we could put the longleaf there. And this is B.W. Wells, another land trust parcel. It's a wet pine savanna ecosystem. This is after we removed loblolly pine. In fact, we tried to take all the early successional species out we could from a timber standpoint, but this was done in an effort to restore grasses and wildflowers, which were very common to this part of the world many years ago. B.W. Wells is a remnant to the big savanna, but it's very similar. So we actually removed Loblolly, we left a few longleaf, and in the left, we actually see pond pine. And this is actually probably after 6 months of growth. This is a copy of the B.W. Wells brochure. It shows fire, large fire, and that's what was done historically in eastern North Carolina. And it wasn't because man started it all the time. In many cases, when we had grass, sometimes fires were started by lightning strikes. Smokey the Bear stopped a lot of that, which is a good thing because we have urban wildland interface now because of development. So it makes it somewhat of a challenge, but through proper management, we can use fire again in an effort to try to help restore the habitat there at B.W. Wells. On the right, we see pitcher plants that are coming up, a few birds, and then the next, a lot of the different plant species, the purple pitcher plant, loblolly bay, sweet bay that might come up, and a number of other trees. We actually have the longleaf pine and pond pine listed there also. And since I talked a little bit about development challenges, sorry about that. 1985, this is a picture of the New Bern area. And try to notice there's very few homes at that time. Just to the left where you see Bryce's Creek, the word, one of the first subdivisions in this part of New Bern is Oak Grove, I think it is, or I might be wrong with the name, but you can see the roads being constructed. This is the Trent River, this is the Neuse River, still heavily to agriculture, heavily to timberland. So in 2019, this is the same area, roughly 7,000 lots at this time. And again, this is the only area left undeveloped, and that's the same little subdivision, Oakview, that's right across from where the little Bryce's Creek dot is. Even across the river, we see development both ways. So what that has caused after the development from a land trust standpoint, and in addition to the challenges of changing succession, it also makes it difficult to manage the property with causing the urban wildland interface. In the old days, a person could burn if they chose without being challenged by smoke management issues. They could create practices working on lands, whether it was through roads, without trespass challenges. And nowadays, that's not the case. We have to get permits to burn. And in here, interesting, that red line is the border of a subdivision, 800 homes that'll be put in. This is a start. In this area, there'll be about 100. This is Carolina Colors for those of you who are familiar with the New Bern area. This is Taberna, starting to encroach on the Croatan National Forest. So the Land Trust has purchased 4 tracts in this area, Bryce's Creek, Trent Tract, a bait tract, and Bern Timber Tract, which actually was a bait tract at one time. And in the effort to try to restore longleaf to the area and actually buffer the Croatan. And the shame of it is these folks probably purchasing houses in this area don't really realize how big a fire hazard they are in. The last big wildfire in our area was a stolen car that was burned on the Croatan, and it created 40,000 acres only about a half a mile south of here. So some of the things that we use as foresters are digital maps. And now that we can see the forest through the trees from the air, we're blessed with the fact that we have satellite imagery, we have aerial photography, and we can actually make some pretty nice maps. When the Bern tract phase 1 was purchased, the tract from Baitland and Timber Company, we were able to get a stand map. This talks a little bit about the ages of the tracts when at that point in time, prior to a developer purchasing the tract, how old they were, and that gives us an idea of what we may be able to do with the tract. The second phase was purchased from a large timber company. And again, they have the same type of information available. We're able to use that data to work and make decisions on what needs to be done into the future. And so this is the combined tract. The National Forest Service is around. The timber company does still own some of the land surrounding, but these are all houses across the other side. And again, this is a digital topo map. We can get on the internet, download this image and put a line around it digitally and create the acreage. It's a process we can use again in the decision making. So this is a digital soils map of the Bern Preserve. It's the next step. So now we knew what the timber types were, mainly loblolly pine. Luckily, the little red area here was actually a remnant longleaf stand. There are some other little areas that we'll talk about as we progress that have longleaf on them on this parcel. But interestingly, all these colors are areas where longleaf is or was potentially existing in the turn of the century era, 1900 or so. So this is our start and our thought process about what we may want to do to try to restore longleaf to the tract. Those are the soil types where we would look at our best opportunities. And those are all the ones that are in color. Now this is an aerial photo of the same area. And this was after a developer had cut the majority of the timber off of the tract. The tract was owned by a timber company, was purchased by a developer. The developer cut the timber back in the 2008 to 2010 era. At that time, the housing market was not what it has turned into today. He eventually sold the tract to the land trust. And the interesting thing in this tract is all these lines, the dark ones, are all where ditches are. Every one of those is a ditch. Some are fairly large, and some of the round areas are actually vernal ponds. So in this particular case, even though this is an upland tract, these ditches were put in an effort to drain some of the vernal ponds, to drain some of the land in an effort to maximize acres available to grow pine trees on. So we'll work to move from the longleaf, or excuse me, from the loblolly to longleaf. And we actually had a meeting yesterday with the Corps of Engineers to talk about the potential to plug some of these ditches to restore some of the habitat from the turn of the century. So now I'm going to move a little bit on things that we might use to change succession. So if we want to change this tract from loblolly and hardwood to longleaf, we may choose to use some herbicide application. We might try to knock back some of the hardwood or the loblolly regeneration if it's not merchantable. In many cases, it is merchantable. We might use the sale of some of the timber in conjunction with a herbicide application. And then we would go and plant longleaf pine seedlings. And this is actually Magnolia Farms prior to planting, and it's actually after we were able to market timber similar to what was in the previous picture, spray herbicide, and I think we've got a few little longleaf seedlings out there. The trees are generally hand planted. This particular photo is not on a land trust tract, but it's one I had available. And they're actually planting loblolly in a bottomland stand that would not be suitable to longleaf. So this is Magnolia Farms a couple of years later. We see the trees a little bit larger. Here we have a 1-year-old longleaf, and this is a 2-year-old longleaf. And so this starts to present some of the challenge. You know, when I mentioned earlier, we could see from an aerial photo all the loblolly seedlings that had blown in to the old field. Well, these probably wouldn't be visible yet from an aerial photography scenario. Takes a lot more opportunity and effort to establish longleaf, and it's the reason why we might need to harvest trees, spray herbicide, and plant. We might want to use prescribed fire. Prescribed fire can be applied from the air, a helicopter in the left. On the right, this is an individual with a drip torch, which is basically kerosene and gas, or diesel fuel and gas mixed together. And they walk through the woods and burn, and they're actually burning under longleaf. And that's to try to maintain the vegetation at a level that will allow the longleaf to flourish. So fire, when it's used properly, this is after a burn. This is Gales Creek where some longleaf was planted. I think these trees might be at this point 6 years old, plus or minus a little bit. They have been burned. The herbicide control was great. The whole tract doesn't look this great, but this is a good example of when things are done well, we have good results. Now, unfortunately, because of urban wildland interface and trespass challenges, fire is not always used to the benefit. We had 2 wildfires, both that were set down at Gales Creek. Many of the longleaf trees that were mature, much larger than those that were in the previous picture, seedlings, and also much smaller than the longleaf that was in one of the early pictures I showed of Gales Creek as a climax forest, are going to not make it. The picture on the left is kind of the edge where some of the trees survived, where the vegetation was thicker from an underbrush standpoint. You can see actually in this picture, we see regeneration. We see the regeneration here of hardwoods. On the left, it's mainly grass, and that's a soil type scenario. So where those waxy leaf species had taken over in an area where the longleaf was on a marginal site, it created more fuel, and the longleaf is not going to survive. We can also remove competition by hand. This is the most expensive way to do it. I mean, we've gone from things that might cost $50 an acre or $100 an acre. Now we might be charged $200 an acre. If there's so much brush, a gentleman with a brush saw, there's actually a blade similar to what is on a skill saw down at the bottom of it, similar to a weed eater, but with the saw on the bottom. Go through and clean out everything, and now we have seedlings that are available for growth. Where here, a seedling's not going to flourish. So as we move ahead, this is again down at Magnolia Farms. Those trees that we saw planted in the 1 or 2 year old range are now in the 6 or 7 range. And because of the fact that we had such ingrowth, these are the longleaf over here to the left. The picture on the right is after. We had a crew with brush saws come in and cut them out to release them. So I added this picture, as thinning was always a challenge for us in the timber products business. In many cases, we had a plant of density that we thought would grow to maturity to where they could be harvested. But probably in the 60s up into 80s, trucks became more available with dual tires that were small. And I just thought this was neat since I live in New Bern, and we put a Pepsi truck, an old vehicle that delivered some of the Pepsi Cola, where crews went out with chainsaws and actually cut the trees into 5-foot bolts, loaded them by hand. And that was a small enough apparatus that could get through the trees and harvest them and sell them to where we could reduce the amount of small trees and increase the growth on the large trees, trying to establish a climax stand. So the next one is a digital activity map. So the Bern tract, again, it's one that we've been working on to remove loblolly and underbrush and plant longleaf. So the small areas that are delineated in black are areas that have been cut over where we will put longleaf back out, and that'll be planted in the understory after we have treated some of the competition in an effort to promote the longleaf habitat. But in this case, we didn't use brush saws. We didn't use fire. We actually used what's conventional logging equipment of our day. So on the left, we have a machine that would cut trees. It's on tracks. It has very low ground pressure and a big saw. And so those are articulating arms. It can cut 3, 4, 5 pieces of vegetation at a time, bunch them to bunching head, lay them on the ground to where they can be then moved up to the landing. The picture on the right is a log loader that may load pieces of merchantable wood on a truck. And also that's a chipper. So in the case of small vegetation that's not large enough to put on a truck, we can actually chip it and remove it from site by putting it in a traditional van. So the next picture is Burn Preserve again. This is an area where we have actually thinned with that equipment for profit. We've tried to restore a stand that would be more natural. It's not in rows. It's open. It's loblolly. But this is an area on the track that was probably loblolly at the time. It's a little bit different soil type and more suitable too. And I added a picture on the right. This is Brunswick Nature Park. Brunswick Nature Park came from a timber company that had done significant reforestation with loblolly, and it had to be row thin because of the beds. In this case, you can see how the land was rowed up. It's a wetter area, so beds were created no different than if a person tried to plant corn. So when it was planted in rows, it made it very difficult to thin. So we did row thin it, thinned in between. And so the next time that a crew went in, they may be able to go in and try to get the row scenario out of it, make it look more natural and carry it on to maturity. So again, we have a picture of the burn track. This is another treatment type. It's an area where we're going to keep mature longleaf trees because of the soil type. On the right, this is after it was cut, and this is the brush that was removed and put in the chipper. So we've been able to restore an area that grew up that was probably going to get to the point where we had a thicket of hardwood that might take 150, 200 years to grow through and make it a good wildlife stand. At this point, there's no understory growth on the ground for wildlife to eat. And this was cut in a long enough period of time where you're actually starting to see some young succulent growth be restored. Okay, and this is another practice out at the Burn Preserve. If a person looks close, they can see pink flags. They may look red in the photo. Those are longleaf trees that still exist. So the practice here was to leave these remnant longleaf stands. There's roughly 6 acres in this picture. We've cut all the pond loblolly out, and we'll actually restore some more longleaf seedlings into the area in an effort to make this a longleaf stand for the future. Now, interestingly, if you remember a picture I showed earlier of all the ditching of the vernal ponds, so this is a longleaf stand, and traditionally we don't see longleaf trees. We don't see a cypress tree. These are loblollies that were left far enough away. They're probably 200-300 yards away from the longleaf. And back in the back, we see pond pine. So this is a pretty unique area. Some of it's because of the ditching allowed all these species to live in the same place that probably wouldn't have been the case many years ago. And again, we can track our activities. So we've got the area we talked about earlier where the longleaf would be planted openly after vegetation control. These 2 areas, we may actually be able to burn the understory prior to planting and just plant in the understory. This is a third area that we have not had any activity in yet that is proposed. So we've talked a little bit about the vernal ponds and the fact that we saw cypress standing in amongst the other trees that it's not typical to be seen with. This vernal pond has been drained. There is a ditch running out of it. It's an area where we're going to plant longleaf around. And interestingly, we had some folks from the wildlife resources come out and take a look, and it was recommended that we actually cut the vegetation to the edge of the water, since it is a drained pond, in an effort to promote herpetology, where we might have more regeneration of frogs and snakes and things, because of the fact that the pond has been restored, some of the vegetation taken out. As these ponds have trees that aren't meant to be infiltrate, they actually drain the pond, because now we have too much vegetation and they suck the water out of the pond, which is contrary to leaving an area for the breeding of frogs. So this is an area close to where the picture I showed early in the presentation of the large cypress. This is a smaller cypress, but if you look, no water, 2 flags here, that's where the ditch goes out. So when I mentioned earlier that Janice and I had talked with the Corps of Engineers yesterday, the hope is to try to see if we're able to plug some of those ditches and actually restore the ecosystem to a more natural vernal pond. Now, this is a vernal pond also on the Bern tract that has not been ditched. And interestingly, you can see there's still water in it today, where every other one I've showed is dry, and part of it because of the ditching. And this picture, shows where the water level is. The vernal ponds do not stay with the same water level. They're at their highest in the winter months. They do tend to dry down, and in many cases they will hold water, but they have to have that opportunity. You can see the rim, where the rim in the other picture I showed just a few ago would have had a ditch cut out of it. So in this case, the water level can get 5 or 6 feet higher than it currently is. In the other picture, it can't, because of the fact that the ditch is there. So I wanted to kind of finish up with a few wildlife pictures that I enjoy. And one, we've got a fairly large bear. Now, this was not taken on land trust property. This is from up in Alligator Game Lands. I was on the other side of the ditch from the bear. I wanted to get to the road, but the bear got there first. It actually came out of a culvert. That area up there has some agricultural land around it. And in the middle of the summer, when it's 100 degrees, the bears actually know how to find the cooler areas, which tend to be the culverts. So if you get off the road, and that might not be a place to look. And so what she's looking at is a bear coming across one of the ag fields back towards the edge of the timberland where that culvert is. And then my final slide is up at Cool Springs, which is another, it's a Weyerhaeuser parcel of land that there's a conservation easement on. And I've worked there as a instructor for 4- and 5-year-olds, all the way up to college age kids to come through. And this was a picture I took right on the edge of a levee of a fawn that looked to only be a couple days old, and was just left on a little ridge. It's actually a swamp all the way around. And that's where she was left. I'm sure mom's out feeding somewhere, and we'll come back to nurse the fawn here soon. So that's all I had slide-wise, discussion-wise, and I'm glad to go back through some of the pictures or answer any questions a person may have.
Thanks, Tim. This is really cool. This has been one of my very favorite talks in all of our little lunch lectures, so thank you. Looks like Don has a question.
Yes, thank you. I know we're in an industrial forest area, North Carolina here, but I'm just kind of curious, Tim, you must be familiar with Suzanne Simard's work on forests and so forth. And I'm
yeah,
just
sure.
Curious, I'm just curious why, the free to grow or the herbicides and so forth is still a factor here. It seems like that her research has proven that if you have mutualistic plants along with your new seedlings, that it's beneficial.
Yeah, we tend not to use products that are going to take care of everything. And I don't want to throw rocks at certain names, but Mazapir is a product that is fairly inclusive as far as taking our grasses and other hardwood species out. So if you noticed in some of the pictures where I mentioned that we did use herbicide, there was a lot of grass coming back in. If you look back a year, one reason we had to go back and use the brush saws to release the longleaf is because hardwood did come back in also. So we're trying to use a product that we can at least get the longleaf out of the ground, promote some of the other, and then use fire in time to try to restore what the original habitat was like.
So my question is, once the longleaf is established, is the hardwood a bad thing to have? I mean, you're talking about 200 year succession. I mean,
yeah. So the answer is it's not a bad thing to have. So some of the areas on the edges where the soil types would allow hardwood to come back once the longleaf is up and burning doesn't occur, it's going to come back. I mean, it's just going to happen. You know, some of the areas on the Bern tract that I showed are actually Autryville soil, which even though it's this far inland, is a very sandy soil. Very little hardwood's going to come back. We actually left a bunch of red oak and beech trees standing and planned not to spray any because that's all that was there to start with. So we cut the loblolly pine out of the understory with the hopes that the longleaf is going to come back with very little activity. And same thing down at Gales Creek. The grass is coming back. You know, if you the picture I showed of the mature stand, that's had no activity in it in a long time. And because the longleaf closed in, it's pure longleaf. So it just depends on the habitat type and what's available. And we try not to spend $150 to plant and lose all the seedlings. We try to make sure that our expense for the seedlings is justified and we at least give them a little bit of a chance as we move into the future.
I just wanted to give a big shout out to Tim. Tim has worked with the Coastal Land Trust now for years on many projects, and I don't know what we would do without him. He is so thoughtful. He is so involved with the activities that go on. He's always rethinking things and trying to tweak. So we've really had quite a bit of success in our restoration work because Tim's been in charge. So we thank you, Tim.
Well, thanks, Janice. I enjoy working with the Land Trust because it's unique. And it gives an opportunity to use things that we learn about and don't always have the opportunity to carry through. So I appreciate the opportunity.
So when Tim was telling the timber crew that, you know, we wanted to cut a few more trees around the ponds for frogs, you can imagine the looks that he got. But, you know, it was something that we were adjusting as we went because we had Wildlife Resources Commission's herpetologists out there. And, you know, instead of keeping all the dense trees around those ponds like we thought we should do, they said, nope, clear around those ponds. So, you know, again, Tim's always willing to adjust and you know, he works with those timber crews and it really helps us out.
And so, yeah, Janice, thanks. And one thing that we've been able to do is, you know, have timber crews that are somewhat willing to work with us. I mean, they have to buy in also. And there's 3 or 4 different colors of flagging out there. We've changed modes of actions. And, you know, as long as there's a way they can make a living, if they can understand what our goal is, they've been willing to work with us. And the crew that I showed some of the equipment on earlier, gosh, they actually helped us at Magnolia Farms, Bern, Trent Preserve. So yeah, that's been one crew that even though they've worked for a number of different dealers over the years, we've been able to find them and they've helped us. So if anybody knows Kyle Carnegie, yeah, if you do and you see him, say thanks to him also.
Tim, I had a question.
Sure.
I just finished reading the same book, Finding the Mother Tree, and I was curious as to how the commercial timber folks are reacting. Are they implementing any of what's being talked about in the science now, or is it just being disregarded?
Yeah, so the big challenge, and I spent many years in corporate forestry, mainly with TMO. So we're talking about money that was invested in pension funds. And so, yeah, return on investment was it. Many of the timber companies have actually started to sell special places, I'll use as a word, to the land trust and or conservation easements as cool springs to the land trust. The challenge being is they've tried to take the stance of removing special places to third parties that could benefit from them more greatly. The core timberlands that drive investment, there's been very little change on, because you're driven by an early succession species being loblolly. So even it needs activities, be it fertilizer, herbicide, weed control, like the picture I showed down at Brunswick Nature Park. I mean, they did the timber company that was bought from did a great job putting a loblolly stand in the ground. Was it a good thing from a conservation standpoint? The answer is no. Was it a good thing to maximize revenue for the pension fund that was driving it? The answer is yes. But they have tried to develop core timberlands and then either sell off or put in conservation easement special places to help offset.
Tim,
and if I didn't answer your question all the way, I'll be glad to try to expand a little more.
Tim, can I ask you a question about ghost forests? The research on ghost forests has just exploded here recently. A lot of activity at Duke. There's NC State's got some activity, UNCW. Can you give pluses and minuses about the development of ghost forests? Is it other than a signal that there's some issues? What's going on there?
Well, if a person was to go all the way back, there's actually a first paper I know of was written back in, it's like 1973 or 4, within a few years of that. And the reason it was developed, the study processes and then the paper, was because back in the 60s, I'll say we humans dug a tremendous amount of mosquito ditches in eastern North Carolina to try to manage better. I think it was a marsh mosquito, and I may be wrong on that also. Those mosquito ditches actually allowed salt water to intrude into some areas that it might not should have been. And in the same cases, during that same era from the 50s into the 60s, many timberland companies in those areas actually dug ditches when they were allowed to, straight to the marsh. So we caused two challenges. One, we allowed more water to get to the timber company ditches inadvertently, and now we might have sea level rise, whether we do or not. I won't go there. But interestingly, in the 1974 paper, when those mosquito ditches were dug, the drag lines that dug the ditches were finding pine and cypress stumps. So there was timberland way out into the marshes long before the first ditches were dug, whether it be by timber companies or by the mosquito ditches. So this is something that's been going on from things I've read, at least back into the 60s, that we're aware of, and obviously a lot farther than that. So yeah, we created some of it, but the history's there. And I wish I wrote down if I thought that question might be asked, I could have wrote down the paper from back in the 70s, but you might even be able to Google mosquito ditches and find it, because I just think that's a real unique one to add to the current literature.
Yeah, I've read quite a bit about the mosquito ditches back in the 50s. Actually, it was all up and down the East Coast. There were even areas you can still see in aerial photographs in Maine, for example, where it had been ditched, and huge areas of marsh that were ditched. So it was a very, very common practice, and for all intents and purposes, the research shows it didn't work. So it was a lot of energy expended for other things other than actually getting rid of mosquitoes.
Yeah, and some people believe that because of siltation, that's caused some of the water level to go up too. And again, I'm not well versed enough to go there, but yeah, we cause some of our own problems. Yes.
Don.
Yeah, another question. So we know how important old growth, middle age growth forests are. What are your thoughts about how we can do that? Right now, you know, it's the third parties like the land trusts that are doing it. Is there any way you can make the carbon credits work, you know, to pay people not to harvest their forests, like pay people not to grow crops? I mean, and make it worthwhile. So maybe an investment firm or whatever, there's a return on the forest.
Yeah, so the carbon credit thing goes up and down, and it is driven. You know, some organizations have taken advantage of timber credits. When I got out of the business, I don't think timber credits for carbon were a significant part of the puzzle yet, to where the powers to be thought that was going to be long term and they could recommend a pension fund to put their money into the credit program. It's money driven. So yeah, if somebody was to figure out a way to increase the value, I think you would see one of the TMOs jump. And usually when one goes, it's kind of like the penguin scenario. They all start to follow. But one's going to have to find out the value there to start with. And maybe one has started to go yet. I'm just not aware of one that has.
Yeah.
Would it be a value of having a surcharge on timber? You know, in other words, recycle it back in.
Well, Don.
Well, go ahead, Janice.
Well, I was just going to say, Don, there are some timber companies that are buying into the carbon market. And you might Google finite carbon. They're one of the companies really going after working with timber companies. And I know Lime Timber Company, Conservation Forestry, you know, there's several that are kind of getting into this. And so there is money to be had. In fact, what's interesting to me is it's not just driven by the carbon offset market from California, it's being driven by a voluntary market, which means they don't have to do this, you know? So there's money being generated and circulated on a voluntary basis. So I recommend Googling finite carbon and seeing the companies, the examples. There was a good Wall Street Journal article about finite carbon's work. And you know, it's somewhat controversial with land trusts getting involved in that, because, you know, what we do is we want to conserve, especially these older mature forests, whenever we can find them. You know, we want to preserve them. And I know land trusts have been getting into that, but, you know, that's kind of our mission. But what I'm hoping is that carbon, there may be a way that we can buy land on the forefront and get paid back through being part of the carbon market. So if this provides a source of revenue for us to buy more land, we want in. So yeah, great questions, Don.
Philip, I see your hand is raised. We have time for this last question.
Yeah. Hi, Tim. It's good to see you again, and thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, it's been a year or two since we saw each other. Yeah.
It's been a whole pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I had a question about how often you run into conflicting, I guess, management advice. I was thinking in particular about the idea of cutting down the trees near this pond, the dead trees near this pond, to support, I guess, you know, lizards and frogs. And I'm thinking, well, dead trees are great for woodpeckers, and I'm sure that you know, you run into problems with, you know, trying to manage for wildlife, or, you know, this particular kind of wildlife versus that kind of wildlife. How often is that an issue for you, and how do you usually resolve it?
I think with working with the land trust, it's always a challenge to try to have a little of all. And so the Bern track is one that we've really tried to have a little of it all. You know, that's why tried to show a few pictures where we had cleared almost all the timber. Somewhere we left, the timber that's just in the middle of the pond, and then a few other ponds where there's no activity at all. And I think that was Janice's mission, to try to see what happens, to maybe do a little research work and in the future as we move forward. From a timber side, if we aren't looking strictly at the land trust, most landowners want to maximize everything they can get by the law. So then it becomes a scenario where, okay, what's a wetland? What isn't? Are you going to be a developer? Are you not? What's the Corps of Engineers going to allow me to do? What are the BMPs going to allow me to do? And what's the forestry exemption going to allow me to do? So if you're asking from the land trust standpoint, I think Janice has gone far and above to get good input to start with, and then do a little of all to figure out what may be the best option. Whereas if you're looking at many private landowners, it's maximizing return on investment.
And Philip, I'll also just follow up on what Tim said. That Bern Preserve is 923 acres. So the ponds that we actually have cleared around are just a handful compared to how many ponds are out there and will remain forested. So yeah, and a lot of what drives our management too is what we call these, rare species. We're trying to help those that are rare, so that we can increase their numbers. And there's quite a few amphibian species that are declining in number. And that's what we're trying to help.
Yeah, so I guess with 923 acres, you hope there's a little bit of room for everybody, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly Tim's point. We've got so many ponds out there. In fact, I can't believe how many he has found. And we have a standing joke between us, Tim and I, that when we find a one we really like, we're not going to tell the amphibian people. We've got a couple hidden ones, that have big trees, and we're like, yeah, we're not going to tell the amphibian people. So there's a lot out there. It's a beautiful, beautiful tract of land. I can't wait to show it to Don, because Don his group helped fund this. So we're going to get a group of the Sierra Club people. Shout out to Sierra Club, because their work has been the reason we've been able to buy a lot of land around the Croatan. So Don, way to go, group.
And to throw one thing else out, Philip, is, one thing that we haven't found on that track yet is we haven't found any Atlantic white cedar. And it's not to say that there wasn't some there, but there is a good chance in some of the wetland areas around some of the higher vernal ponds, where they're closer to the Pecosins, there's a good chance that where the organic soil is, there could have been Atlantic white cedar there too. So, it's been a very interesting process. I mean, it's a big track and a lot of opportunity.
What a great discussion today. How cool. Thank you, Tim, for being here and sharing clearly your passion, your expertise with us. And that was really cool to see some of those bits and pieces of the Bern tract that you can't, we're not going to get to see that from where we sit right now. So it's really cool to get that little background view of that property. I wanted to give you guys a heads up of what's coming up for Little Lunch Lectures. We will have one Little Lunch Lecture next Friday, as always, on Masonboro Island and sea turtles that are nesting there. It's the start of the season. So Elizabeth Calhoun is going to give us an update on sea turtle nesting on Masonboro Island, which will be great. Encourage you all to come back for that. And then we're going to take a little bit of a break for the summer. We will have one a month. So June, July, and August will each have one Little Lunch Lecture. And we don't have dates, but please do watch your e-news and your social media to get the dates and topics for our summer Little Lunch Lectures. But otherwise, please be outside and enjoying amazing weather and nature as you can. And I did want to give everyone a heads up on Flytrap Frolic. I announced last week that we were going to be doing short tours in the garden, and all of them are full right now. So the next option of our like hybrid frolic day is that we will be releasing a 360-degree video, which is a really cool thing, where you can interact with the reader garden and you can kind of walk along the path, you can click on little icons, pictures will pop up with more information. There might actually be a video of Stanley Reader in the garden talking about the garden hidden in there. So I encourage all of you to go to our website, coastallandtrust.org/frolic on June 5th. We're not going to release it till then. And feel free to take your own tour of the reader garden virtually. And then of course it's opened onto Dust 365. So y'all get over there and see it because it's really cool. So we will see you guys back next week for Little Lunch Lectures, and have a great weekend. Again, Tim.
Hey, thank you. Enjoyed it. Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.